let's get something really sci-fi reason for why people would be doing this loop thing. And the other interesting innovation is that Jake Gyllenhaal plays a character that it's only an 8-minute loop. He's on a train each time. The train explodes at the end of the 8 minutes. He's got 8 minutes to try to find the terrorists and try to find out information that will stop future terrorist attacks. And he's also trying, when he comes out of it, he's like in some capsule, and he's, what in the world's going on? And eventually the people who are talking to him tell him, like, you're part of some weird science experiment. This isn't actually happening. It's a computer program. So just get back in there and find the terrorists. So you can get pretty elaborate with some of these.
And in Star Trek, it's always the holodeck or the transporter.
Yeah.
Those are always the reason. It's always the holodeck or the transporter. Don't get in either of those if you end up in a sci-fi place. Don't get in a transporter.
And those are related to like these narrative crutches where you have like Deus Ex Machina on one hand, and you have like sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic.
Right.
So it's like, if you don't know Deus Ex Machina, it just means, it's kind of like in Lord of the Rings where they can't figure out how to get everyone out of the situation, so they just have eagles sail in and save everyone. It's just like a random thing that wasn't
magic solution. Or
for those people who saw Into the Spider-Verse, I love the fact that he's like, oh, you have a goober. And he's like, what? What's a goober? It's like, oh, it's some sort of multiplexing encryption, but we just call it a goober. It's basically the thing that you plug into the machine to fix everything. And I love the fact that, because there's another wonderful book, if you like humorous science fiction, there's a book called Red Shirts, which is one of the best books. But these are the guys who work for all the people who are like the main bridge crew of like a Starship Enterprise. And the guy's like, I want you to do an analysis of this. And he walks out, and the guy goes, what kind of analysis? What are we supposed to do? Do we have funding for this? And the guy goes, dude, just put it in that box and hit the button. When it goes ping, they'll come back. And then you hand them this pad, and it'll tell them what they want to know. It's like just basically kind of making fun of the fact that we put all this technological psychobabble into it and have it somehow make sense. It's kind of fun.
Yeah.
Okay, so what are the ethical and moral implications for characters as they jump around in time? We talked about this a little bit with people just kind of like willy-nilly time traveling and not paying attention.
So there seems to be two ideas, right? Like there's this linear, there's like one trajectory, and then there's the other thing where it kind of happened in Russian Doll, where every time you go back in time and change something, it splits off into 2 or more universes. Mm-hmm. And so effectively it doesn't really matter because there's already like infinite numbers of universes anyway. So you're just screwing over everyone in this universe, but you'll never have to see them again. So who cares?
Well, I think it's fascinating in Discovery in this new show that we've gotten so much more into areas of gray, because it used to be like people in that other universe, they're the bad guys. They are the racist, sexist, jerk, awful people. They're barbarians, they're pirates. The fact that they can bring Philippa Georgiou over to our universe and have her successfully masquerade really kind of shows the ethics and the morality of the place that she joins. She joins a group called Section 31, which is kind of like the NSA of Starfleet. But the idea that maybe we're not so very different from our evil selves if somebody can come over here and successfully integrate. It's kind of interesting.
I just had one kind of funny commentary on the whole consequences. Again, if you ever find yourself caught in an infinite time loop, one thing Bill Murray's Phil character does is like they have a scene with him like at a diner, and he's like shoving cake into his mouth, smoking a cigarette, and just he's got plates and plates of food. He's like, I don't even have to floss anymore.
Well, and that's like the character Alan in Russian Doll. One of the characters just he's been stuck in a time loop longer than Nadia's character, and so every time you see him when he starts out, he's like sitting on his couch playing video games, eating like a whole chocolate cake by himself. It's like, who cares?
But then his fish disappears, and he gets very sad.
He gets very upset.
Phil also has this great line where he's like, I don't have to follow their rules anymore. He's like, be nice to your sister, do all that. He's like, oh, and don't drive on the train tracks. And this guy next to him was like, well, that one I kind of agree with.
Yeah, and so I want to show this image because you can barely see. So this is a very young Christopher Walken in a movie called Dead Zone. And so this movie came out, I want to say, let's see, I think it was like 1982 2 or 3 or
Sounds
something
about
like
right,
that. And so the premise of this is basically that Christopher Walken's character, whose name is Johnny Smith, not kidding,
Of
that's like
course.
it's awful 80s laziness. But he gets struck by lightning and he gets psychic powers, and he goes to this political thing, and he meets Martin Sheen's character, who plays like a senator running for president. And he shakes his hand, and he realizes he has like a psychic flash, and he realizes that if this guy gets elected president, he's going to cause a nuclear war. And so then he makes it his mission to try to assassinate this guy. And it's this weird thing where it's not necessarily like a time loop, but it does have this character dealing with these temporal flashes. And I think there's a lot of shows and movies that sort of play with that. Maybe,
Kill Baby Hitler thing.
right, or like a cinematic time loop instead of like a plot time loop too. Okay, so this gets us into Doppelganger. I'm going to talk about this a little bit. So this is an early photograph where this guy is just playing with double exposure. So this was like a huge deal back in like 1850 something. But the idea of the doppelganger, it's again very prevalent in mythology. The word comes from a German word that comes from German mythology where they're talking about a spirit double that's different from a ghost. So what is a doppelganger kind of like in the shows that things that you all are talking about?
Take it first, or?
I can.
Yeah, cool.
Well, the one thing that's really interesting is this concept of the other me, which is what every single one of these folks, when they find out that there's an alternate timeline, they're like, oh, well, what happened to the other me? In one of the episodes in Deep Space Nine, there is a holy man named Bedek Bareil, and he's basically kind of like a Tibetan Lama kind of a person. And his counterpart in the other universe is a con artist and decides to come back over and steal these religious icons and create the religion in the Prime universe and the one that we follow in the Mirror universe and establish himself as a god. That's like his decision. So this idea, like everybody who has a counterpart is kind of, it's always their darker self. It's the thing of what could have happened if something would have happened differently in my life. The other one I think is really interesting, and I know that I brought this up earlier, but the concept of sex and sexuality. In a lot of cases, the doppelgangers are almost always non-binary, or they are pansexual, or they are experimental, which I thought was really fascinating, because in every single one of these, the main character, especially the female ones, are very much like just very sexually open and sexually fluid, and I wonder if there is something Yiddish about that or something guilty pleasure about that. But I think the doppelganger is kind of that question that we have about ourselves. What would be the worst reduction to the absurd if we were the other way? So that's what I don't know if that makes any sense.
I'm intrigued by the notion of, again, us kind of makes me think of this more than other things I've seen, of the notion is like, what if it's like, what if the other side is not evil, or what if we just characterize that we've got an evil twin and
what if we're the evil twin?
Yeah, and there's always that notion that nobody wakes up and says, I'm going to be evil today, and all those good people, I'm going to mess with them. So they think that, and I can't think of like a specific example right offhand, but I know a lot of shows where they've met their doubles. It's used as a way for the evil version comments in ways that sort of is very judgmental of oh, you think you're so good,
like
well,
the good chorus almost.
yeah.
And that totally happens in the episode of The Next Generation we were talking about where Data meets his Lord, who's like his brother. They're both androids, but the evil twin keeps saying like these very subversive things that as the viewer you're kind of like, he kind of has a point.
Yeah.
You know? So are doppelgangers and time travel related? The reason I ask this question is, okay, so first of all, there's this, can you go back in time and meet yourself? And if you can, that's a doppelganger situation, right? And then of course, this is Bill and Ted's bogus journey. So they're meeting the future us's, as they call them. So do you guys think there's a relationship between those two things?
Well, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, in the movie I talked about Triangle, it's like, yeah, it's it's a weird kind of time travel or whatever. Just and there's actually a thing that happens in the where there's she breaks out of the loop, but she is sort of transported to earlier that day, and then she meets, and this is where we see that she's abusive for the first time. She goes back to her house and she sees a version of herself, like slapping her kid and whatnot.
Yeah.
And it's almost like, did you forget that you were the one who did that? But it's, yeah, so that's sort of, and she actually tells her son, you know, she kills that version of herself, and she tells her son that wasn't mommy, this is mommy, mommy's nice. So I like the doppelganger as a way of saying, just that whole notion of like, and then we see very quickly after that, has she really changed that much sort of thing of like, maybe there's this notion of character is fate, and I think time travel narratives, a lot of times you try to stop something and you end up causing it.
Yeah.
So
That's why they always say don't do anything differently. It's like hug a tree.
Yeah.
Well, there was a really interesting concept. I was actually reading this book, which I don't know if I recommend because it gave me a headache in some places, but they talk about at what point does Spock, because Spock is one of these characters that is in every single one of these universes, and there has been with the J.J. Abrams movies this idea that like there's an alternate universe Spock that comes in and then eventually he dies. It's very weird. And he actually discusses this idea of because you are constantly replacing all of the biological material in your body, you know, as you grow, at what point do you stop being you and you become somebody else? And so therefore, if you went back in time to meet yourself, would that really be yourself? That was like 3 lines in this. That's why I don't necessarily know if I would recommend that, unless you have a lot of time. But it is really interesting, this concept of like, you know, timeline-wise, if you could go back and meet yourself and then make changes in what you decided to do. Like if you could go back in time and give yourself some advice and say, hey, don't do this, do that. Does that create a second self? Would you still remember it when you came forward in time? And so there is this really constant idea of, yeah, definitely doppelgangers and time travel matter because, you know, you're constantly reinventing yourself. If you went back in time and saw yourself at 12 or 10, would you be you? And that's that whole nature versus nurture debate that has been raging for quite a while.
Right. And so this gets us into the final question. So this is from the movie Memento, which I don't know if I would recommend seeing it.
It's like this book.
So it's the whole premise of it is essentially that there's this guy who loses his memory, and every day he goes back to like square one. So he can only, I guess he loses his short-term memory, not his long-term memory is what it is. And so he starts like getting tattoos of things on him, you know, like on his wrist, say like, don't trust this person. And he takes all these Polaroid photos, which is what photos were before we had cell phones. So it's like, that's what he's holding. And he like take a picture of someone and write, don't trust this person on it. But so this idea of the unreliable narrator, I think it kind of fits into what Tim was saying, where if you have a doppelganger, like, and you know, maybe there really is this like definitive good and evil, how do you know who is who? And especially when you're watching it on a screen, how do you know which person you're supposed to trust?
Yeah.
Right? So, I mean, do you all have any thoughts about that? Do you think that the idea of the unreliable narrator fits into this? And I'll tell you something else. So, the other thing, in the Bill and Ted movies, there's this George Carlin character he's like the psychopompous, which is like the guide of souls. He comes back in the future and he tells Bill and Ted, this is what you need to do, and they just trust him.
Yeah.
And so, like, what are the implications if you have a dystopian situation where someone goes back in time and they're like, do this, and then that's really going to cause?
Well, it's really in Discovery, the whole first season, the captain of the Discovery is Captain Lorca is his name, and he has us doing things that we're all kind of like, that doesn't seem very Starfleety. I don't know about this. This seems really kind of weird. Like he wants us to torture this animal. I don't know how I feel about this. But then it's like, no, it's for the war. You know, like we're doing it for the war. We're doing it to save people. And he basically convinces these people, hey, you know, this is okay. This is what we should be doing. And what's really interesting is you look at that quote that I had for the Discovery. It talks about like, they finally figure out that he's actually the doppelganger of Lorca from another universe. He's the Terran, he's the bad guy. And so it's really interesting. There are places where you really like him. And so, you know, then you start going like, well, who else is a doppelganger? Who else can't I trust? And I'm thinking immediately of Battlestar Galactica. Who's a Cylon? You know, like who's secretly a robot? But I think that there's that concept of an unreliable narrator of, that's one of the reasons why we kind of like these narratives, because it's something we don't know. Because in a series that lasts like 7, 8, 9 seasons, which is what American television does, we know these characters inside out, inside out, upside down. So when we can interject some tension, some dramatic tension, that makes it interesting. That's why we like it.